Prince Charles, Princess Diana, and Camilla Parker Bowles, perhaps the most famously tragic royal triangle in modern history. But how did the bond between these two women truly evolve? How did they find themselves drawn into this tangled romance? And was there ever a moment where it all could have unfolded differently? In today's video, I invite you not just to revisit the facts, now etched into history, or their portrayal in The Crown, but to take a step further, to look at each of these women through a different lens. Before we dive in, I'd like to ask two simple things of you. First, try to see each of these three people in full dimension, without judgment, without placing blame. I truly believe that history, much like life, is never just black and white. It's made up of endless shades of grey, and every figure from the past, even those who lived in our own time, are, at the core, simply human, flawed, complex, and deserving of compassion. And second, if this video gave you something to think about, a like would be the best way to say thank you in return. And as always, when we begin exploring the lives of historical figures, I believe it's important to start with childhood, that formative period which quietly but powerfully shapes who we become. It is in the home, in the family we're born into, that we inherit our first emotional patterns, where we may either absorb trauma or build strength and resilience. And for the two women we're speaking of today, Diana and Camilla, their early experiences could not have been more different. Diana described her childhood as very unhappy. Those years left her emotionally bruised and vulnerable in ways that would follow her for the rest of her life. Camilla, in stark contrast, called her upbringing perfect in every possible way. But let's pause here, because there's something important to note. Neither Diana nor Camilla came from modest or ordinary backgrounds. These were not young women from working-class families who stumbled into royalty by chance. Diana, as many of you will know, belonged to the prestigious Spencer family, a noble house tracing its lineage back to the 15th century. Her father was a viscount and later became an earl. Camilla, while untitled and technically not a lady like Diana, came from no less notable stock. Her mother was the daughter of a baron, and her great-grandmother, as history remembers, was the mistress of King Edward VII. It would be fair to say Camilla's family stood firmly within the British gentry. This gives us a clearer sense of the world they came from, long before Charles, and long before their lives became public stories. But when it comes to unhappy marriages, status means very little. Aristocrats and commoners alike are vulnerable. A privileged background doesn't protect anyone from emotional misfortune, and this was certainly true in the case of Diana's parents. Their marriage mirrored in many ways what Diana would later experience with Charles. There was even a similar age gap. Diana's mother, Frances Roche, was just 18 at the time of her wedding. Her father, John Spencer, was 30. Diana was the third child, or, more precisely, the third daughter. Born into a family that longed for a male heir, someone who could inherit the title. That pressure became even more intense after a deeply traumatic event. Just a year before Diana was born, the long-awaited baby boy died only 10 hours after birth. At one point, she reflected, "I couldn't understand why I was perhaps a nuisance to have around, which in later years I've perceived as being part of the whole question of the child who died before me." So, they were expecting a son, and instead Diana arrived. Her name wasn't chosen for nearly a week, a delay that again hinted at the disappointment surrounding her birth. Eventually, she was named after her distant relative, Lady Diana Spencer, her full namesake, who in 1730 had once been set to marry the Prince of Wales Frederick. That marriage never happened. The prince ultimately chose Princess Augusta of Saxe-Gotha instead. An interesting coincidence, isn't it? Especially considering that the First Lady Diana Spencer also died young. In any case, up until the age of 5, one of Princess Diana's nannies described her early childhood as carefree. But everything changed in 1967 when her mother left the family home and separated from Diana's father. Diana would later recall painful, traumatic memories from that time. "I remember seeing my father slap my mother across the face," she confessed. "I was hiding behind the door, and Mummy was crying. I remember Mummy crying an awful lot." What followed was a long and bitter custody battle, one that her mother ultimately lost. And perhaps most heartbreaking of all, it was Diana's own grandmother, the one depicted in The Crown, who testified in court against her daughter. Daddy never spoke to us about it. We could never ask questions. Very unstable, the whole thing, Diana would later say. And her younger brother, Charles Spencer, added this reflection in his memoir. While she was packing her stuff to leave, she promised Diana she'd come back to see her. Diana used to wait on the doorstep for her, but she never came. Diana also had a difficult relationship with her new stepmother. She openly disliked Rain, whom she referred to as a bully. At one point, Diana even pushed her down the stairs. And here's another, perhaps less popular truth. School was never Diana's favourite place. She failed her O-level exams twice. Eventually, she left West Heath, the girls' boarding school in Kent, and briefly attended a finishing school for young ladies in Switzerland. But the fact remains, she never completed any formal education. And that would later become a meaningful factor in her relationship with Charles. A Cambridge graduate, a lover of art, and a passionate environmentalist who longed for intellectual connection, someone to engage in hours-long conversations about the world he cherished. Diana, at that age, preferred reading romance novels, the kind of dreamy, emotional stories she may have imagined for her own future. She also had a deep love for ballet. At 17, she enrolled in the Vakani dance school, hoping to become a dance teacher, something she truly wanted, but just a month later, she dropped out and went skiing instead. It was a pattern that would repeat itself in her early life. Great enthusiasm followed by retreat. A search for identity that never quite found a home. As shown in The Crown, Diana really did work as a nursery assistant, and also took on cleaning work, to earn a bit of extra money. She earned just £5 an hour. Her family had left her an inheritance, and she wasn't facing financial difficulties. But she worked in order to feel part of everyday life. To put it in perspective, the London flat she shared with friends had been a gift from her mother for her 18th birthday. Still, this early work experience made Diana the first member of the royal family to have ever held a paying job, and, in some way, it gave her a glimpse of real life, as much as was possible in her position. Perhaps it was during this time that Diana discovered what she truly loved, caring for others. I'm sharing all of this so we can begin to form a more complete picture of who Diana was by the time she found herself entangled in the triangle with Charles and Camilla. Understanding what Princess Diana experienced in her childhood and teenage years allows us to look at her differently. Now just think how desperately she must have longed for the kind of love she didn't receive as a child, and how deeply she must have dreamed of building a family that would be nothing like the one she grew up in. Unlike Diana, Camilla Shand, that was her maiden name, had a remarkably lively and happy childhood. Raised mostly in the countryside of East Sussex, she was incredibly close with her siblings and parents, Bruce and Rosalind Shand, who, quite unusually for the time, were known for being warm and attentive. It was her father, in fact, who first instilled in her a love of reading. He often read aloud to her, and Camilla became an avid reader from an early age. Like Diana, Camilla was not particularly academically driven. She didn't strive for high marks or formal success in school. Camilla was described as a tomboy, known for her boisterous sense of humour and utter lack of self-consciousness that made her a favourite of both sexes, but especially the boys. Her school nickname was Milla. And although, like Diana, Camilla was never particularly academic or ambitious in her studies, this never seemed to bother Prince Charles. After finishing school, she spent 6 months studying French language and literature at the British Institute in Paris. But like Diana, she never pursued serious career ambitions. For a while, she worked as a secretary and later as a receptionist, until she was fired for returning late after a night out. On March 25, 1965, Camilla made her formal debut in London society and fully stepped into the social scene. It was there that she met Andrew Parker Bowles, the man who would become a central figure in her life for many turbulent years before they finally married. I believe that the contrast between these two childhoods shaped Diana and Camilla in profoundly different ways. Diana's early experiences left her emotionally fragile, always seeking love and stability. Camilla, on the other hand, gained a strong sense of inner grounding, a confidence that came from a secure and loving family, Diana entered marriage wanting to build something entirely different from what she had seen in her own upbringing. Camilla, by contrast, seemed to want to recreate what her parents had. And it was with this very personal emotional baggage that both Diana and Camilla would enter their connections with Charles, though, of course, not at the same time. So now, let's shift to the year 1970, when Camilla and Charles first met. There are different accounts of how Charles and Camilla first met. One version says it happened at a polo match. According to one popular rumour, at their very first meeting, Camilla said to him, "My great-grandmother was the mistress of your great-great-grandfather. I feel we have something in common." Their relationship lasted for about 2 years, until Charles was sent to serve in the Royal Navy. Charles later described that time as blissful, peaceful, and mutually happy. But even they must have known that Camilla was never going to be considered a suitable wife for the heir to the throne. She had already had past relationships, and her family background, while respectable, didn't quite reach the level the royal household would have preferred. As the royal historian Robert Lacey wrote in his book, Charles met Shand too early, and he hadn't asked her to wait for him before leaving for military service. But perhaps Camilla herself, who had been entangled in a complicated on and off relationship with Andrew Parker Bowles since the age of 17, wasn't ready to wait forever either. Maybe she too was looking for some kind of resolution. Charles was stationed in the West Indies when, on March 15th, 1973, he received the news of Camilla's engagement to Andrew Parker Bowles. But the question remains, did the Queen Mother, or anyone in the royal family, play a role in the sudden marriage between Camilla and her first husband? Royal editor Robert Jobson, in his book, described the icy contempt Charles's grandmother reportedly felt toward Camilla. The name Camilla was not to be uttered in the presence of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. Like Wallis Simpson before her, Camilla was simply referred to as that woman. And that makes it all the more curious that the engagement ring Charles would eventually give Camilla, decades later, came from the Queen Mother's personal jewellery collection, inherited by Charles after her death. Fate, it seems, has a sense of irony. So, was there royal interference or not? According to another royal biographer, there were no formal family meetings, no consultations with Camilla's relatives, and no strategic matchmaking. In other words, it's likely the Queen Mother stayed out of it entirely. However, there is one interesting detail. The families of both Andrew and Camilla published a formal engagement announcement in the newspaper, essentially pressuring Andrew to propose. Nevertheless, Charles and Camilla continued to maintain a close friendship even after her marriage. Meanwhile, the entire royal family watched closely, awaiting the emergence of the perfect bride for the future king. So, how did Diana and Charles actually meet? Well, she certainly wasn't darting through hallways in costume during their first encounter, as The Crown would have you believe. In reality, their first meeting took place in November 1977, during a shooting party at Althorpe, the Spencer family's country estate. At the time, Charles was romantically involved with Diana's older sister, Sarah. Reflecting on that meeting, Charles would later say, "I remember thinking what a jolly and amusing and attractive 16-year-old she was. I mean, great fun and bouncy and full of life and everything." Incidentally, Charles's relationship with Sarah didn't last long after that. It came to an end when she gave a rather unguarded interview to the press, speaking openly about her struggles with an eating disorder, casually mentioning thousands of boyfriends, and adding, rather indifferently, that she wouldn't marry the Prince of Wales if he were the dustman or the King of England. Diana also attended Charles's 30th birthday celebration at Buckingham Palace alongside her sister. Then, in January 1979, she saw Charles again when she and Sarah were invited by Queen Elizabeth II to a hunting weekend at Sandringham. Diana didn't need a formal introduction to the royal family, as the Crown might suggest. She already knew them quite well long before she became Charles's girlfriend. In fact, she had played with Princes Andrew and Edward as a child at Sandringham, and she used to call the Queen Aunt Lilibet. But she really did visit Balmoral in the summer of 1980, as portrayed in the series, and by all accounts, she made quite an impression. Royal biographer Penny Junor later wrote, She seemed the perfect girl. She was funny, she was fun, everyone appeared to adore her, she made them all laugh. And she seemed to adore Charles. But the first time Charles truly saw Diana as a potential girlfriend was at a quiet house party hosted by one of Diana's friends. Sitting side by side on a hay bale at a barbecue after a polo match, 19-year-old Diana gently offered her condolences to Charles for the recent loss of his beloved great-uncle, Lord Mountbatten. Nevertheless, around the same time, Charles resumed his romantic relationship with Camilla, who was also there to comfort him after Mountbatten's death. Her husband, for the record, didn't mind. He had his own affairs during the marriage. Diana would later claim that she and Charles had met only 13 times before getting engaged. And most of that time wasn't even spent alone, she said, so we barely knew each other. But did Diana truly understand who Camilla was at the time, and what role she played in Charles's life? What was the dynamic between them in those early days? In Biography of Camilla, Penny Junor describes how, in 1980, Diana visited Camilla and Andrew's country home not long after she began dating Charles. Apparently, the two women got along quite well. Diana, with her natural ease around children, even helped Camilla with her two kids, Tom and Laura, a former nanny lending a hand, in a way. Incidentally, Charles was Tom's godfather. Diana and Camilla both attended the Ludlow races, watching Charles compete, and it marked the first public appearance of Charles and Diana as a couple. At the time, Charles simply referred to Camilla as a friend, without offering much detail about just how close that friendship really was. According to the biography, The Man Who Would Be King, Camilla invited Diana out to lunch in February 1981, and reportedly did so with genuinely friendly intentions, even saying she would love to see the ring. This moment is portrayed in The Crown, though the real-life meeting likely carried far less dramatic tension. And no, the restaurant was not actually called Ménage à Trois. Still, Camilla did ask Diana a number of questions about her relationship with Charles, something Diana would later recount to Andrew Morton during the writing of her biography. Diana said she suspected that Camilla was trying to find out when she and Charles would be apart, and when she might see him alone. Diana likely began to suspect her fiancé's infidelity when she discovered a bracelet Charles had prepared as a gift for Camilla. In The Crown, Diana finds a sketch of the bracelet, but in reality she found the actual finished piece. It was engraved with the letters G and F, the initials of the nicknames they had given each other, Fred and Gladys. Here's how Diana described the moment to her biographer Andrew Morton. "I walked into this man's office one day and I said, 'Ooh, what's in that parcel?' And he said, 'Oh, you shouldn't look at that.' So I opened it and there was the bracelet. I was devastated and I said, 'Well, he's going to give it to her tonight.'" Charles did, in fact, give Camilla the bracelet with the engraved initials, and just days before his wedding to Diana, he had what was essentially a farewell lunch with her. But what The Crown doesn't mention is that Charles had also prepared parting gifts, not only for Camilla but for several of his ex-girlfriends as well. Tokens of appreciation, as he put it, for their friendship. But what do you think? Did Charles truly end things with Camilla before marrying Diana? Because if there was still something between them at that time, then yes, it was cruel. Diana was just 19, young, inexperienced, and completely unprepared for the emotional complexity she was being drawn into. Meanwhile, Charles and Camilla were both in their 30s, with long histories of relationships behind them. They knew exactly what they were doing. And more broadly, do you think Charles ever truly loved Diana? And now we come to one of the most difficult topics portrayed in the series: Princess Diana's eating disorder. It's no coincidence that I spent so much time earlier talking about her childhood, because the stress surrounding the engagement and the overwhelming public attention fell onto a deeply fractured emotional foundation. Let's not forget, even Diana's sister had spoken to journalists about her own struggles with disordered eating. There were patterns, visible ones, and Diana's condition didn't arise in isolation. One thing The Crown leaves out is that Diana herself said the disorder began after a remark Prince Charles made about her weight during their engagement. In her biography, Diana recalled a moment. "Charles put his hand on my waistline and said, 'Oh, a bit chubby here, aren't we?' She once said. And the Camilla thing. The first time I was measured for my wedding dress, I was 29 inches around the waist. The day I got married, I was 23.5 inches. I had shrunk into nothing from February to July. Diana struggled with bulimia for years. She referred to her eating disorder as a symptom of what was happening in her marriage. I believe this is a complex and deeply nuanced issue, and it would be unfair to place all the blame solely on Charles or Camilla. The situation was clearly much more complicated than it might seem on the surface. But one thing is certain, Diana chose to speak openly about her illness. And by doing so, she helped countless women realise they weren't alone in their struggle. One thing the Crown didn't show during the wedding of Charles and Diana was the presence of Camilla, who was, in fact, there. She had been invited because her husband, Andrew Parker Bowles, played an important role in the ceremony. As the commanding officer of the Household Cavalry Mounted Regiment, he oversaw the ceremonial escort that accompanied Charles and Diana's carriage during its procession through London. Camilla wore a pale grey outfit, strikingly close to white, whether by coincidence or quiet irony. And as Diana and Charles walked down the aisle after the ceremony, both of them looked at her. And here's what Diana would later say about it. I knew she was there, of course. I looked for her. So walking down the aisle, I spotted Camilla. She was wearing a pale grey veiled pillbox hat. I saw it all. Her son Tom standing on a chair. To this day, vivid memory. Even more ironic, years later, at her own wedding to Charles, Camilla would again wear grey, while Queen Elizabeth II, attending her son's second marriage, would appear in white. The Queen, it must be said, had quite the sense of humour. Happily ever after may work in fairy tales, but real life is always more complicated. So let's pause here and take a short breath. Part 2 is coming very soon, where we'll explore the intense early years of their marriage, the eventual divorce, and Diana's tragic death. There's still much to say, and even more to compare between the series and reality. In the meantime, let's talk about this royal love polygon, because as we've seen, it's far more than just a triangle. Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd truly love to hear what you think. See you in the next video.